Hey there, Eli here, and today we're going to continue on our discussion on evaluating items. In my previous video, I talked a lot about primary modifiers. So your life and resist modifiers are generally what we're talking about here for armor. And in terms of weapons, primary modifiers on this would be the flat elemental damage. It has a lot of it, even though the rolls are bad, and the attack speed and the crit chance. The resist modifier, if you remember, is not a primary modifier on weapons. Okay, so today let's start by talking about everything that doesn't come on a base item. Okay, we're talking about influence items, we're talking about shaper items, elder items. So let's pop out of the game real quick and let's go back to PoE DB. So here I have gloves up, and last time you'll remember we talked about max life, max mana, our resistances as primary modifiers. The problem comes as a newer player or even a veteran player that never really looked into this kind of stuff is when you start scrolling down, we have Shaper mods, we have Elder mods. Now we have Crusader, we have Redeemer, we have Hunter, we have Warlord, we have Delve, we have Incursion modifiers, and then we have the Crafting Bench. There's a lot of modifiers that are ready and waiting to overwhelm maybe a majority of players, I don't know, a lot of people, when they look at an item that drops and say, how much is this worth? Is this a good item? Now, one way we could go about discussing this is I could go through this entire list and we could talk about what are theoretically primary modifiers. The problem with that is most of the Shaper and Elder and all of these other modifiers, most of their value comes from being synergistic for specific builds. So if you imagine a base item has its primary modifiers for its damage as a weapon or its life and resists as armor, then these other modifiers are really kind of more specialized, generally speaking. And that makes it very difficult to establish easy general rules for determining value, which is why we don't really see videos explaining that very effectively. I'd like to take a different route. Instead of looking at all these modifiers and trying to place them in some kind of modifier tier list, the better way to go about this and the smoother way as a player actually playing the game is to use Awakened POE Trade. That's right, I gotcha. This is actually an Awakened POE Trade video. Suck it. Now, the reason why this application is so good is because if you've been around for a while, you'll remember that when we want to go sell an item and see how much it's worth and we aren't sure, our steps were kind of like this. We'd come to the trade site and we'd say, okay, well, we have modifier, we have life. Yep. Do we have increased maximum life? What's the actual mod on that? Maximum energy shield life. There it is, percent. Okay, great. And we have critical strike chance for spells. Okay, great. Is that a thing? No, it's a body armor. I have to put in, etc., etc. We'd have to do all these steps. It's annoying. With Awakened POE Trade, however, we can click a button and we have all of the modifiers listed for us right there at the press of a button. And now I can go in and say, okay, 93 max life, that's pretty relevant. And the fire damage and the flat fire damage, these are all pretty important. And the elemental resist. Maybe the strength is important. We'll see. Now I just scroll down here. I've got a list here. That's great. I just want to click this button. I don't have to leave the game. And here we are. We have our list of items that are fairly similar to the item we just listed. Here's ours. And here's some more. This one's 1.5 exalts. Okay, we can look at why. We can say, oh, they have 45% increased elemental damage, at least for attack skills. And they have all of our stats, but they have more. We can see all of this kind of at a glance. This is why, in a nutshell, Awakened POE Trade is what you should be using in order to learn how to value items. Now, what we can do is we can take an item like this and say, oh, okay, we've got a specialized item here. We have this increased critical strike chance against shocked targets. So we can say, all right, we've got our total elemental resist. It's very convenient. We've got our life, our mana. These are primary modifiers. Now we have specialized modifier of crit chance against shocked enemies. There's nothing else up there. Okay, let's take away mana. And let's take a look. Okay, now we've got some hits. So now we can kind of go and see, okay, let's, we've got crit chance against shocked, we've got some resists. What's ours? Now we can look and compare and say, okay, I have 74. Do any of these have mana? Well, let's take a look. I see life. How about, okay, you know what? I'm going to go to the actual trade site. I'm going to click that button. And now I've got all my filters set up. So we're going to say yes. Let's put all of these up here. You know what? Let's take away that. So we have pseudo, elemental resist. Let's say, how about 20 mana? We have a lot more. Okay, so now we have, this has intelligence. So this one is worth more than flat mana as it applies to more builds, and more benefit to more builds, right? So all of this is done in, what did that take us? Like a minute, maybe, as opposed to traveling to the site and punching in all of these, finding these values for the modifiers in the list, and then saying gloves, non-unique, and we want to put energy shield so we know they're intelligence gloves if that matters, etc. etc. All of these things the application just does for you, so that when you find a drop like this and you're like, wow, I think this is worth something, now I can go in and punch in the values very easily because it gives me this list right off the bat. So when it comes to valuing items, you know, specific rares with maybe Shaper mods or Elder mods or Hunter Redeemer mods, etc., I recommend using Awakened POE Trade just to cut down on all of the minutia of finding the exact modifiers in the trade site list and punching in the values. It does it all for you. Okay, let's move on to talk about how I view item slots in Path of Exile. Okay, so I'm going to assume that we're talking about a rare item in all of these because uniques have a specific purpose, whereas rares are a little more malleable. So when we look at rings, we're looking primarily at stat fixing, so attributes like strength, intelligence, and dexterity. Rings are an excellent slot for if your character needs 100 dexterity, but it's a witch and doesn't go outside of the witch area, or maybe over into the Templar area, and there's not a lot of dexterity to be had, and it needs maybe 155 for greater multiple projectiles or something like this. So stat fixing is a great spot for rings, which means I'm looking primarily at attributes, life, and resists. Sometimes damage rolls, but usually those three. Boots are often fairly straightforward. You have our primary modifiers of our movement speed, our life, and resists. The resists are barely on the scale of primary. They're sort of interchangeable with other pieces. So what I mean by that is if you have a pair of boots that instead has movement speed, which is critical, as well as tailwind and elusive modifiers, which are very expensive, rather hard to get, these can be in place instead of resistances, because resistances can spawn on essentially anything. So you can find those elsewhere, and they're all over the tree too, and in jewels. It's a lot of ways to get resists. There are not a lot of ways to get elusive and tailwind. So these specialized modifiers can take over the role as primary and push off resistances or even life or mana or energy shield, for example. You can take a hit on those in order to get these other mods because their potential boost is so large. Now, when we talk about gloves and helms, we're actually talking about a lot of similarities here, because the reason gloves and helms typically get more complicated in their valuing is because the Elder and Shaper versions of them can have support gems built in. So if we hop over to PoEDB and we look at our Elder prefixes and our Shaper, we can have socketed gems are supported by Mana Leech or projectile speed. These are for the gloves. And on the suffix side, we can have all of these. We have advanced traps, trap and mind damage, just the trap support gem. We have blind. We can have faster casting. So this is problematic when it comes to valuing things, because if we go over to our helm and we look at Shaper, we start getting like increased area effect, hypothermia, innervate. These are difficult to value in because now you have the potential of a helm or glove that is effectively a 6 link. This has a lot of implications for the type of gear that you can use in your body armor slot or your weapon slot, because now those don't have to be 6 linked necessarily. So when we talk about gloves and helms, we're talking about a lot of the same ideas. We still have our primary modifiers, we still have our life and resist, those are critical, and to a lesser ish extent, attributes, because helms and gloves are a great spot too for attribute fixing. But now we have the monkey wrench of these added support gems. And that's not even talking about essences, which is another layer. So as you can see here, we have weapon and then gloves. That's how this list goes. So you could have gloves that have 16% more attack and cast speed, coupled with faster casting on gloves, or faster attacks maybe. So you can see where these layers of items, it gets very difficult to determine value unless you have a solid idea of what could spawn on the gloves, as well as what is innately synergistic with themselves. And this comes with time, and it comes with the more builds you play, the more your ideas about what is synergistic and what is powerful gets expanded, and you have a better idea. So until you reach that point, like Mathil and all these other popular streamers have reached, they've seen all these builds, they've built so many different variations of things. There's a good sense at a glance as to what is synergistic, what is rare, etc., etc., etc. This is why Awakened POE Trade, again, is so useful, because you don't necessarily need all of that knowledge. You just need to be able to navigate this. But back to gloves and helms, that is generally what we're looking at. We're looking at attribute fixing, we're looking at our primaries of life and resist, and if it's Shaper Elder, or maybe it has one of the Conqueror influences, this is what we're looking for. These are the kind of synergies we're looking at, either socketed gem supports on top of good life and resists, or some other specialized mod from another influence. The belt slot, typically pretty boring, pretty straightforward. Oftentimes you'll want an abyssal because you can have an extra gem that has a whole boatload of modifiers you can add on that normally a belt can't have. On top of that, there are specialized Conqueror influence mods. There are things like increased cooldown reduction. This is really good for like trap builds, for instance, and other specific kinds of builds. Typically, when I'm looking at a belt, for most builds, it's just going to be the primaries. It's going to be your life, your mana, and maybe a stat if you really need it, like strength, maybe. But I think I'd rather take just a high life roll or another resistance instead of strength on my belt. As for amulets, we could talk for a long time about amulets, so let's leave that for another day. Suffice it to say, an amulet can go either highly defensive, highly offensive, and everything in between. There are a lot of modifiers that go on amulets. There's essentially nothing they can't do. So when it comes to an amulet, I'm essentially looking at, all right, what tier is the modifier? Is it tier 1 to 3 on all of them? Do all the modifiers, are they synergistic with themselves? Again, go back to my previous video. We can talk more about that. If so, it probably has value. Let's load up Awakened POE Trade. Let's click the button on it. Let's figure it out. Now, weapons are a little bit of an exception when it comes to the socketed by support gems, because most of the time, with the exception of Fortify, you don't really want your weapon to use up one of its mod slots to have a support gem. This is because, again, most of the time, an actual damage modifier is going to be worth more for your effective DPS output. The most notable exception is having Fortify on your weapon. Oftentimes, the ideal version of this is to corrupt the weapon so that it is supported by level 10 Fortify. This is obviously extremely hard to get because there are a lot of veil modifiers and it can break your item. There's all sorts of things that can go wrong. So I wouldn't worry too much about that. There are some noteworthy mods that I'll bring up off the top of my head here. For melee weapons, the modifier that gives a 60% chance for your bleeding or poison to deal double damage. These are separate modifiers, one for bleed, one for poison. That is a valuable mod. And when it comes to bows, the ability to fire additional arrows and the plus level of socketed gems. If your weapon fits into one of those categories and has one of those modifiers, I would definitely take a look and see what its value is compared to others that are similar to it. Other than that, our weapons serve our normal purpose, like explained in my previous video, of dealing damage and synergistically dealing damage. Now, I know we just went through a lot. I threw a lot at you, trying to summarize a lot of mentalities that I have and ways to value items in addition to what we already discussed earlier. If you take away anything, make it be this. Awakened POE Trade cuts out a lot of the middle steps in order to effectively value items in the current economy that they're in. There really is no reason not to use it, and quite honestly, Grinding Gear should implement this as part of the game. You don't really have to retain anything that I told you in this video if you are good at using this application. Because instead of looking through the tiers and saying, oh, this is really special, blah, 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 you can just kind of check off boxes and see if it has value. Now, that said, if you do take what I'm saying to heart, you'll be even quicker at evaluating what the modifiers are that are important to be looking at and ones that aren't. And as usual, if you found this video helpful, you like what I'm doing here, go ahead and hit like and subscribe. It helps me to know that I'm on the right track. Until next time, stay sane, exiles.